Hey, welcome or welcome back. Glad to have you either way. We have made it through January officially somehow, which means that we are through the start of the reading year and it is time to wrap up January reading. I read 12 books this month, not that the number matters in and of itself, but just to give you some kind of context and bearing within this video of where we're going to be or where we are at any given moment. I started off the month with a reread that is a HarperCollins Avon title for my romance book club, and that is Never Judge a Lady by Her Cover by Sarah MacLean. And I will not be talking about that further or reviewing because as of this recording, the HarperCollins Union is still on strike. So there we go. And then I read my first new book of the year, which will be no surprise because it was also our first Feature Friday of the year, and that is The Villa by Rachel Hawkins. This follows dual timelines, and in our more contemporary timeline, we have two more estranged childhood best friends. One is a cozy mystery author and going through a pretty messy divorce. The other is an incredibly popular self-help guru and internet personality, and she invites her friend to a retreat at this Italian villa, only for them to discover that this villa was the site of a particularly gruesome murder in the 70s involving a very big rock star and a woman who would go on to write an incredibly popular horror novel that kind of revolutionized the genre, as well as her sister who wrote a very notorious album that came out of this kind of stay and this event. So both of these stays are explored in these dual points of view, and it's looking at what we know of this event, what the reality was, how it was put out in art, how that kind of persists, and how narratives can be shaped. And at least in the historical point of view, it's this kind of mashup of the house party that gave us Frankenstein meets Fleetwood Mac meets the Manson murders. So there is a lot going on, and it is a really breezy, quick read. Hawkins's novels, whether her thrillers, her romances, her young adults, they move very quickly and they're very quippy. I responded to this one much better than last year's Reckless Girls because I was more interested in the kind of literary rootings of this with the kind of Frankenstein angle than I was with what Reckless Girls was exploring. At the end of the day, honestly, these are just fun, quick ways to start the year, and I think that Hawkins really has her pulse on kind of the zeitgeist and the cultural moment, especially with kind of looking and leaning into this like self-help guru angle. And I'm always very interested in how she attacks these things and the kind of commentary she provides without it being explicit commentary, and this was just fun. I don't think it was perfect, to be completely honest, but honestly, most things aren't, one, and two, that's not necessarily what I was going into this looking for. It kind of delivered on exactly what I was expecting of it. There were layers of feminist critique to it. There were opportunities, of course, I think, to develop the characters and some of these B plot lines a little bit more, to connect the dots a little bit more, and I do think that there was room to make that happen because the novel is so short, but at the end of the day, I had a good time and I'm not mad about it. And then I read Lord Olympus Volume 2. I don't really have much to say about these, I don't think, because I don't really know enough about art and graphic novels to really critique the art style or anything of that nature. I guess similar to how I don't have that much knowledge of poetry in order to critique the actual poetry part. But these are fun so far. Like with Volume 1, I'm still kind of agreeing with my friend's assessment that these are more of a borrow than a buy for me personally, and I indeed did borrow it. I'm a little hesitant on the characterization of Persephone right now and how kind of naive and childlike she is being presented, and I get it within the context of the myth, but in the dynamics of the relationship, it's just like, I'm not sure yet. But we are still so early in the narrative storytelling of this, and we're still kind of just laying the groundwork. So I think that we are going to see major transformation from all the characters yet in this series, and I'm intrigued to see where all of that is going to go, what plot lines get brought in, and how we continue to develop and explore this world. So I will definitely be picking up Volume 3 from the library and Volume 4 when that comes out. I don't think it's out yet, but correct me if I'm wrong. But at the end of the day, this was an enjoyable time, and honestly, it was a good palate cleanser, so I'm enjoying my time with this series so far. And then I read Liberation Day by George Saunders. I actually started this in December, but this was one of those titles that I kind of let roll over into the new year, so I wasn't rushing through them and could properly appreciate them. And this was one of the main reasons I wanted to do that, because I needed to spend some time with these stories. I've only read one other short story collection from George Saunders, probably unsurprisingly, that was 10th of December, and it has been a second. I did read that after I read Lincoln in the Bardo. Lincoln in the Bardo was my first George Saunders, and as much as I have mentioned Lincoln in the Bardo on this channel, it is actually probably much less than I talk about that book in real life. I recommend that book pretty frequently, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that this is Saunders's first short story collection since Lincoln in the Bardo. So I definitely was excited for this and wanted to pick it up. And it started expectedly so weird. And that is one thing that really draws me to Saunders's work, and I think it draws a lot of readers, or that is what is appealing to a lot of readers. And as much as I talk about the kind of oddness in Lincoln in the Bardo too when I'm talking about it, I think that I often forget to mention how funny that book is, how tongue-in-cheek. And it's funny in sometimes these like dark humor ways, sometimes these slapstick ways, sometimes like the lowest common denominator type ways, but also in ways where it is simultaneously offering these really insightful and deep cultural critiques. And so there are levels to both the storytelling and the humor in this, and apologies that this cover is probably going to be blinding at some point. But when I started this, it was in the midst of all of the stuff going on with my family in December, so I wasn't sure how focused I was. I was kind of in and out of things, and honestly, I feel or have been worried about my focus the last couple of months anyway. I think I'm gonna try and start pulling back from places like TikTok too. I'm not blaming a lack of attention on that, but I think that I just personally have had less of a focus lately, and that, you know, is a combination of factors and world events, but it's definitely impacting my reading, so I really want to recenter. Long tangent aside, when I started this, I was having trouble rooting myself in the first story because it was so weird and it threw us right in as readers. We had to kind of start in the middle and look around this very odd world and make sense of it. And the collection is named after this first story, and it involves like humans on almost this kind of peg wall visually, and how they are being used to kind of act out stories and how their memories have been wiped. It is, as I said, very odd. And then there is a story later called Ghosts that like takes place in this almost like subterranean like hellscape, but not like hell, but like kind of, but this hell is more like the haunted house you would go to at a church. And there are all of these rules that exist for these people who work there, but there seem to be no patrons, and they're all part of these scenes they're acting out, but we're only seeing them in the in-between of their day-to-day life. It is so weird, and I love it. So this collection is essentially a weird, darkly funny meditation on modern life and the kind of current landscape that ultimately really trusts its readers to keep up, and it doesn't necessarily need to give us answers, but rather it is thrusting us and these characters into these very odd and heightened circumstances and kind of exploring human nature within those heightened circumstances, which adds this extra layer of humor for sure, but is also incredibly damning at some points. So definitely recommend if you like your short stories weird. These are excellent, unsurprisingly, honestly. And then the other book that kind of carried over from December to January with me was Young, Damned, and Fair by Gareth Russell, which is a look at Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII. And we read this for my book club. It also helped me get back into a kind of audiobook groove. Not that I'm back to like full-paced audiobook listening, but when I found that I've been in kind of a rut with audiobook listening, one, nonfiction really helps, and two, I already am interested in Tudor history and this kind of era and the wives of Henry VIII anyway, so I was very interested in this kind of reclaiming of Catherine Howard's history, especially post-6, because as I've said before, I think 6, while it has a lot of problems, admittedly, even as enjoyable as I find it, I think it is the most successful at reframing Catherine Howard's story. I think it made me look at her and consider her in a different way after listening and watching, in a way that I don't know that it really upset my expectations or views of any of the other queens. That's neither here nor there. But her story is the most complicated and often the least told. And it definitely tells her story, but she admittedly starts to get lost in it toward the end. And another thing that me and my book club talked about, because we've already met about this, was how odd it kind of was. I'm not saying with this, to preface, that men can't write about women or right women. But at the same time, it was occasionally a little odd with some of the motivations Russell was speculating, especially for teenage, well, she was always a teenager, when she was in the house of the Dowager Duchess. Kind of that era. Like early teenage girl brains, I don't even remember how my brain was working at that time, honestly, but everything was so heightened, and especially like the politics of this were so heightened, the stakes of everything here were so heightened, so there were times that some of that speculation just didn't seem to completely align. At the same time, I do appreciate, because I think he tried not to speculate too much. He wasn't trying to project too much onto this history, but because of that too, that is part of, I think, what lost Catherine a little bit, because we only have so much of the record for her. And so he is kind of drawing the wider landscape and contextualizing everything, but in certain cases that ends up with us again knowing more about the men around Catherine than Catherine herself, which I know is the world at the time too, but still. I do appreciate where he has kind of called out and contested other common conclusions about Catherine Howard and her household and the kind of workings of this time, not in just like a scholars feuding kind of way, but in a way where you can kind of trace how the scholarship and the thinking about this has developed over time. Another thing in that exploration of scholarship and how things have kind of developed over time that I really appreciated was its exploration of Tudor portraiture, especially because right now there is that Tudor exhibit at the Met, which I don't think I'm going to be able to get to, and it makes me very sad because they have all those Holbeins, and anyway. But it talks about how a lot of these portraits we have attributed to people, and especially wives of Henry VIII, that we don't necessarily know if that's who they are, even with the limited circle of women who would have had access to this. So I really enjoyed that kind of exploration of what portraits are being kind of like attributed to which women based on kind of what is most popular as well. I do think that this did an excellent job at kind of helping contextualize again, one, how young Catherine was. I think it did a great job at kind of looking at what led to her becoming queen, especially kind of like taking us back to the failed marriage between Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII. And then also, I especially appreciated the kind of deeper dive into the investigation around her and how kind of thorough it was, especially in comparison to Anne Boleyn's investigation. And I'm not a historian by any means, but I thought it was a very interesting look, especially thinking about how fast all of that moved. And I liked how Russell kind of like laid out some of his thinking in relation to that historical record. Like there was a point, and I don't remember the woman's name, where a woman who had lived with her with the Dowager Duchess wrote to her after she became queen or was becoming queen and was building a court. And there had been a kind of common acceptance of the fact that this woman became part of her court because she was holding these secrets over Catherine's head, potentially. But Russell took us back to kind of the interviews in the historical record and was like, well, it doesn't say that she's a lady of the queen here. It doesn't specifically mention her in relation to the court, which it probably would have. So we really can't know for sure if she was in the court. It's unlikely. There were just a lot of things that I did appreciate. Now, that being said, it was pretty dense even to listen to, and my friends in book club who got the physical copy, I would 100% recommend listening to this. The text is really, really chunky. There's not much breaking it up. The font is small. The page is large. I think that this is going to work better on audio, honestly, and especially because it listens so much like a podcast in some ways anyway. Sure, it's a little drier than a podcast at times, but I had fun listening to it. So if you're interested in Tudor history, I would recommend this, especially as part of the wider picture and wider dialogue. I don't necessarily know that I would recommend it in isolation, but as part of like a wider thinking and study of these women and this time, I definitely think it is worth your time if interested. And then I read Highly Suspicious and Unfairly Cute by Talia Hibbert, which we have already talked about, but this is her young adult romance debut. If you are looking for a cute romance for February, this will 100% fit the bill. It involves friends to enemies, to academic rivals, to lovers amidst a wilderness camp for high achievers looking to gain a scholarship. It's got that trademark Hibbert charm and banter, a slightly prickly heroine who is understood completely by her love interest. I just really enjoyed this. And outside of the romance component, I think it is a really layered exploration of kind of the next step in your life in the teen years, looking to the future, kind of battling your wants with expectations or what you think will look good to the rest of the world versus what you are actually actually passionate about. So yeah, I think it's just incredibly fun, and especially for young adult readers, I think it will be incredibly satisfying on multiple levels, for adult readers too, but I think for young adults, it's going to be that much more immediate, obviously. Then I read The Survivalists by Kashana Cauley, which we have also already talked about. This follows a single woman in New York City who is dating and trying to make partner, and she hits it off with this coffee entrepreneur who also is a survivalist and lives with survivalists. And she gets kind of pulled into this world in unexpected ways. It's a kind of darkly satirical look at our current moment and what survival in our current moment means, particularly for the millennial generation. It has an incredibly strong voice that really hits us right out of the gate. I will say that it kind of loses a little bit of momentum, especially like midway through till the end, because I think the expectation of action that is set up with that strong start isn't necessarily fulfilled. However, I do believe that it is exploring this topic in the way it intends to, and I think that in its own way, that tone is really settling and exacerbating that kind of existential dread for us as readers. It is really heightening the absurdity of the mundane through making us really live in it and sit in it and asking us to view it as normal and think that it is normal going forward as we kind of heighten the stakes, and also where the stakes don't heighten that we might expect them to. And it is incredibly metaphorical as well in a lot of its exploration. So if you're interested in that kind of tongue-in-cheek look at survival in the current moment, I definitely think that this is one to pick up, but just have the kind of proper expectations for the pacing and the way the voice develops and how it might not align with what you think it's going to be initially, but how it's definitely executing as intended. So a very interesting read and a very compelling read for sure. And then potentially speaking of as intended, I read How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell. This I thought, and I think a lot of my friends who read it or were interested in it as well, thought it was going to be kind of on the precipice of self-help. Now, I don't like self-help, so I wasn't sure how I was going to react to that, but I was intrigued enough by this idea of doing nothing and the subtitle of Resisting the Attention Economy, which may seem contradictory because I'm on YouTube talking about books, but just the idea of the kind of constant pressure to push. And when I was in college, I mentioned this before, especially in the video I did talking about this in relation to self-help, I had a professor who told us and emphasized the importance of kind of sitting and staring at a wall to the creative process, having those moments of downtime, those lulls to kind of spark creativity, this idea that we can't always be pushing. We need that time to kind of reset. In the same way that after a workout, you need those rest days for your muscles to kind of reset and grow. I think it's all kind of part and parcel. So in actuality, this ended up being more loose essays, kind of philosophical musings around this idea of doing nothing, of kind of slowing down. It doesn't ask us to completely pull back from modern life. It doesn't posit, quitting all of your social medias and running into the woods like transcendentalists, even if it does talk about transcendentalism without directly critiquing some of the privilege of the biggest transcendentalists, but that's neither here nor there. And it does attempt to kind of explore the privilege in the current moment of doing nothing and how it's more of a mindset on a continuum or a spectrum, because there are a lot of people that can't afford, to have rest days to the full extent, unfortunately, and what all of this means. And it looks at this through a variety of different lenses. So it does look at it through like labor movement lenses, creativity and creation lenses, because she is also an artist, the lens of our relationship to the land and nature and how that plays into things. So there's a lot of directions that this takes. I don't know if it fully succeeds in every essay because I didn't always feel the full cohesive point, and the language could be a little dense, a little bit of a plod to get through, admittedly. I think this was most extreme in the introduction though, so if you have had trouble getting through the introduction, know that it does get easier if you are still interested in this. I think that it offers lots of conversational openings. I think it would make a great book club book. Like I've said, I posted this on social media and got lots of questions from people in my friend group that had either read it, started it, been interested in it in terms of what I was thinking of it, and I had done the same for people in my circle who had posted it on social media even before that. So there is definitely a lot of discussion that this opens, but I think if you go in expecting straight self-help, you're going to be disappointed in some way. I think that if you go in expecting straight essays, you will be disappointed to some degree as well. I think it's this kind of bleeding of a lot of different things, and it's more, like I said, these kind of ponderings and musings. And I think if you go in with that, you'll have more level expectations in terms of grounding yourself in what it's doing. So I don't know. I ultimately am not sure what I thought of this at the end of the day, I don't think, but I am still very intrigued by the ideas and I'm glad I read it. And then I read Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett. This is something that lives kind of, it's not full cozy, but it's also not exploring the kind of full darkness of the Fae as has been popular within the last like 20 years or so. But this follows a woman in this kind of alternate fantasy historical setting who is setting out to finish her Encyclopedia of Faeries. She's vying for tenure at the university she teaches at, and this has been kind of her life's work. And so we are following this journey for her through her entries in her kind of like field journal. And her work is kind of upset at the onset by both a kind of faux pas with the town and how they perceived her or responding to her after that, and also the appearance of her colleague Brambleby, who she kind of grudgingly accepts, but also suspects that his knowledge of the Fae, because he is also a scholar of fairies, is a little bit more firsthand than he is letting on. And so they are both drawn into this town, this community, and this place's relationship with its fairies and how fairies are impacting the community. So while not a mystery, if you like historical kind of long-running series of mysteries like the Veronica Speedwell series, you will definitely like this, I think, because we are setting up a series here and a partnership between Brambleby and Emily, so we don't know nearly everything about these characters, but we're just starting to get a sense of the world. I'm very intrigued by the possibilities that are being established in moving to different places and exploring fairies in different parts of the world, so we'll see how much lore and mythology it really delves into. There were admittedly a couple of stumbling blocks in this for me, especially in relation to the kind of fieldwork journal format of the storytelling. The voice didn't feel completely authentic in that form for me, admittedly, but it wasn't so much of a stumbling block that I'm not going to continue with the series. It was just a thing that would occasionally take me out of the world because I felt like I could see the maneuverings of the story a little bit more at times. I do wonder if some of that could have been fixed with just page layout, oddly enough, but I don't know. And I do admit that that can seem a little superficial, but sometimes our brains are a little superficial. And then I read Spare by Prince Harry. Listen, lots of people have talked to you about this book at this point, probably. If you are interested in this book, you have probably watched many people or listened to many people talk about it, so I won't dwell on it too long. First, one of the most important revelations for me personally in this book was the fact that Harry and Meghan got engaged on my birthday. Does that matter to literally anything? Absolutely not. But as expected, this book really does seem born of intense therapy, and he does talk about his therapy journey within the book itself, which I'm very happy to hear that he is pursuing, because at the outset of the book, the trauma of losing his mother and the kind of disassociation that happened basically almost immediately for him, and the way he talked about it was incredibly heartbreaking. And this sense of kind of isolation and loneliness that permeated this book. I think that he is incredibly lonely in a lot of ways. And I'm not going to pretend to have like any major knowledge of the monarchy, but the picture that he paints of it rings very true. This kind of Hall of Mirrors effect of looking behind the curtain. It feels like very backstage access, and not like in a rock show way, but in like a theater way where you go backstage and everything is like stripped to the bare bones. You can see the costumes hanging for the quick changes, and everything's a facade to a large extent. However, the exploration of the monarchy was not his goal here. Rather, his goal, to my reading, was one, to tell his own story when the story has always been told for him or about him. And in terms of the about him, to get back at the press. And not in a vindictive way, but in a way where he has never been allowed to stand up for himself. And it is clear that he has been wanting people in his life to stand up for him, and now he is having to stand up for his family and for others. And so there is a great sense of the pain that the press have caused from that first initial trauma to the current moment. And while I have a sense of the vitriol that has been spewed around all of this, I don't have the full sense of it by any means. And so yes, there were parts of this that were absolutely kind of cringy, kind of like, why are you telling me this? But it was, I think, one, as other people have posited, to get ahead of the narrative, and two, to be the one to tell it. It humanized him in a way as well, and drew an extra underline to some of the absurdity. Now, were there moments where I felt like he stepped into accountability, but didn't fully take accountability? Sure, but I guess I also understood parts of it more in context with the lack of education that comes from that isolation. And I don't know, there's still that level of individual responsibility, so I'm not wiping slates completely clean by any means, but I ultimately appreciate that this offers a wider, more complicated view, that it was at its heart an incredibly personal story, and I think it is going to end up being invaluable as a resource for historians. I think that it's easy to kind of like pull out some of these sound bites and be like, tee hee hee, because some of the sound bites are amusing, but we have him telling his own story in his own words in a way that I don't think we've really seen before, and correct me if I'm wrong. So I think this is going to be an invaluable resource moving forward. I think that this has probably been incredibly healing just to get out for him, period. So yeah, I guess that's all I really have to say about that in this moment, but if there are other parts of this memoir that you want to talk about or unpack, let me know below. And then I read, also for Romance Book Club, or reread, I should say, Kiss of the Highlander by Karen Marie Moning, which is a very old title that I knew might not age super well. And let me tell you, I was correct. Oddly enough, this reminded me that there used to be a Random House mass market romance imprint. I don't think that's still a thing, especially since the merger, but if I'm wrong, let me know. But this takes place in the early 2000s. It is kind of living in that in-between of the Outlander craze and the paranormal romance craze, and it follows Gwen, who goes to Scotland for a vacation that ends up being a senior citizen bus tour, and she inadvertently wakes up an enchanted Highland lord who is Drustin, and then they end up going into the past. There is some not great Roma representation right out of the gate, I will warn you. There is some fat shaming in a way that just like reminded me how pervasive and how we talked about bodies at that time, in a way that I didn't love remembering, but didn't think one thought about at the time. And it also had some references to cherry picking right out of the gate, which I think, especially at the time, was supposed to be tongue-in-cheek and quirky and a little bit on the edge, and now just feels incredibly weird. And this was initially my first book in this series when I first read the series as well. And if you've recently gotten into the Fever series, especially with the resurgence of that on TikTok, this is connected to that tangentially. This is kind of the start of the thread that will lead us to the Fever series. It was interesting what I remembered from this book and what I absolutely didn't, and also the pacing of it was much different than I remembered. It was like 30% in before we went back in time. Spoiler alert, maybe. And I don't remember it taking that long the first time. And as long as that took, some of the emotional jumps felt very quick. At the same time, there were still moments that were pretty funny, like when she locks him into a garderobe. So I don't know, I was really conflicted about this one because it definitely didn't hold up necessarily to my memory, which I knew it wouldn't, to be fair. But this was one of the first romance series I read. I think I read this around the same time I read Bridgerton, so it kind of looms large in my memory. So yeah, like I said, did not hold up the best, as was anticipated, but it did make a pretty interesting discussion in Romance Book Club, so there were multiple different discussion angles and things to talk about. And then finally, and most recently talked about, I read We Are Also Good at Smiling by Amber McBride. This is a young adult novel told through verse that explores grief and depression through the lens of fairy tales and the liminal space of the forest, and it also instills bits of magic into the everyday. In addition to its fairy tale angles, it also has a little bit of kind of Dante's Inferno imagery, and well, it's referenced directly in the text. And then once we're in the forest, kind of facing the heart of a lot of the things at the center of this story, it's kind of operating in similar ways, but also not in ways that I can make direct comparisons, especially in terms of kind of like the stratification. There are levels that become or feel evident, circles if you will. And these characters are very much moving through their own personal hells, but there's also not judgment on it in the same way that there are judgment on the levels in Dante's Inferno. And in fact, the text actually kind of combats at least one of those levels in particular. And like I said Friday, and I've said before, I am not super versed in poetry in the sense of being able to pick apart poems and analyze poems at their root. However, I think the choice to use poetry in this book was incredibly impactful. I think it really relayed the emotional and mental state of these characters, and it just made everything kind of flow and also helped with the kind of magic elements of everything with that fragmentation. And additionally, even amidst the poetry, there was a great sense of forward momentum and movement to the narrative. So I thought that this was really beautiful. I thought that it was tackling some really weighty subjects with a lot of compassion and grace. And I think that it was really interested in kind of exploring stories and narrative, the stories that we tell about ourselves and in general, and how those can kind of be mirrors for one another and how they can shape our reality as well. So I think that this covered a lot of ground, both physical and emotional, within a very short novel told through poetry. So definitely something to check out, especially if you're looking for a quick but impactful read. And with that, that was January. So not off to a bad start, I would say. I am excited for more of my library holds to continue to trickle in, especially as we are now really rolling with new releases for the year. I'm excited to see what we're going to get this year, what we are going to be able to talk about, and incredibly excited to see what the rest of the reading year will bring. What did you read in January? What were you excited about? Did you read any of these titles? Let me know below, but thanks for hanging out and listening to what I read. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it, and yeah,